improvise, adapt, and overcome.
Hey everyone, welcome to the Carry On Podcast SITREP edition for the week of 20 March. We have had some adjustments to the production schedule recently. However, we will be back to our regular time slot next week, so no one panic. I would like to mention our latest Patreon members, James, Jenny, Joshua, and Griffin. And Griffin, I am particularly happy that your wife is now a listener as well. I hope you both enjoy it, and to all of you, thank you. This supports the show in so many ways. Without you, we couldn't grow and continue to have this ongoing conversation about the world melting down. Because we are fairly close to last week's SITREP, we are going to briefly check in around the world with any highlights before we go into some details, predominantly here on the home front. Oh, by the way, beverage of choice for today's broadcast is a porter. Keeping it light. I still have the rest of the afternoon that I have to work my way through, so I don't want to get too bourboned up. All right, on the domestic, the U.S. military is operating in a CENTCOM-heavy wartime posture, let's call it. Every other command is either deterring opportunists, protecting the homeland, containing secondary fires, or sustaining the force that CENTCOM is burning through. The command map is not evenly weighted. As you can expect, CENTCOM is the main effort because the Iran war is consuming operational attention, force flow, and a lot of escalation bandwidth. European Command and Indo-PACOM are in deterrence maintenance mode, trying to keep Russia, China, and North Korea from exploiting U.S. distraction. NORTHCOM and SOUTHCOM are absorbing homeland-adjacent pressure in the Western Hemisphere, while AFRICOM is suppressing jihadist flare-ups at really a low cost. Let's not forget, we've got SpaceCom, STRATCOM, CyberCom, SOCOM, and TRANSCOM are the invisible spine. They're warning, deterrence, cyber defense, precision options, and logistics. So let's talk CENTCOM briefly. No big surprise, active warfighting and possible expansion of missions tied to the Hormuz and Karg Island operations. Reuters reporting the administration is weighing additional troop deployments and some broader operational choices. We're not going to dive too deeply in that today. We're going to visit that one in a future broadcast. I want to give the time a little bit. I want things to marinate. European Command. The posture statement stresses Europe's strategic geography and global utility, while the Pentagon coverage says NATO military ties are remaining strong. Okay, got it. Indo-PACOM. They responded publicly to the DPRK ballistic missile launch on the 14th of March. We talked about that in the last broadcast. Reminded everyone that there is no immediate threat to U.S. personnel or allies. Moving over to AFRICOM. Nothing significant to report. NORTHCOM, no change. Let's take a look at a couple of the commands that we don't get a chance to see very often. Let me check notes here real quick. A lot of times we go around and we hit the combatant commands in order. I want to throw in just a couple of new ones this time. Let's visit SOUTHCOM briefly, Western Hemisphere. Most of the things that are taking place in SOUTHCOM are security cooperation and the congressional focus. A lot of commands have been on Capitol Hill. We're going to talk about that in a moment. Speaking to Congress, members of Congress, not just for budgets, but also kind of justifying what it is that they're supposed to be doing. Space Command, busy defending the homeland, and is always preserving space advantage. They're also improving a lot of allied and commercial integration. Space right now, this is a warfighting dependency for every theater. It's not just a support luxury. SpaceCom, I think up until recently, has been kind of an enabler, but they're not. They're a standalone combatant command, and you really can't do any operations anywhere on the planet without them. Strategic Command, we have not spoken about. There are a lot of other combatant commands, and it would be beneficial at some point just to do a deep dive about how the United States divides the globe, how we assign combatant commands based off of geopolitical and a whole host of other things. And they do expand and contract. We talked about it a little bit when we were speaking about the national security strategy rewrite, but I know we've never spoken about Strategic Command before. So they're really performing an underappreciated role. Their job is to stop a regional war from becoming a multi-theater strategic crisis. They're currently focused predominantly on deterrence, integration across domains, and then a lot of strategic competition with China and Russia. We're probably going to check in with them a little bit more in a future podcast, just so, like I said, we can all understand the combatant commands. Cyber Command, the Cyber National Mission Force, also known as CNMF. Remember, they are the U.S. military's premier joint cyber force, consisting of roughly 2,000 personnel, all charged with defending the nation against foreign cyber threats. They are a subordinate command of U.S. Cyber Command, but the public signaling is limited, meaning there's not a lot of information on them right now as to what they're doing. They did just have a change of command, and Cyber Command continues to frame CNMF as the force defending the nation in cyberspace. The public silence is deceptive, though, because cyber pressure rises exactly when real-world conflict expands, and right now, is it expanding? Iran actually launched at least one cyber attack that we know of, and I think everybody pretty much assumes that more are on the way. So we'll keep an eye on them, check in with them when there's something more to report. Another command that we don't talk about a whole lot is SOCOM, Special Operations Command. Senior SOF leaders were on Capitol Hill this week, stressing their capability and some of their force challenges. Another combatant command we don't talk a whole lot about is TRANSCOM, or Transportation Command. Publicly visible this week, though, through testimony alongside European Command leadership on the budget and the posture. In fact, from 17 to 19 of March, European Command, TRANSCOM, NORTHCOM, SOUTHCOM, and SOCOM leaders all appeared before Congress for posture and budget hearings. The quiet commands may really be the decisive ones. Space Command, STRATCOM, CyberCom, TRANSCOM, and SOCOM. They don't dominate the headlines, but they determine whether the force can still see, move, communicate, deter, especially in the case of SOCOM, strike precisely when a lot of these stresses increase. So, absolutely. I think it's pretty obvious to many, CENTCOM is burning oxygen, and the rest of the command structure is really trying to compensate. Now, that does not mean that the United States is near collapse. It does mean the margin for simultaneous surprises is much thinner than I think Washington would like to admit. I applaud the commander-in-chief's moxie and zeal, but I think the veneer is starting to wear, and we're seeing some things that are underneath it they probably don't want us to see. Okay, let's look at what is taking place in the current conflict with Iran. And I want to do this a little differently. I want to start here at home with a recent hearing that took place on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. on the 8th of March. Here are a few of those who attended. I want to talk about what their position in government currently is, what their stance publicly on Iran was, what was testified about, and then how the two are kind of contradictory, and at least in some cases. I want to look at how it shifted. What are the implications of those shifts? I'm also throwing in a few other folks for context into this conversation, as you will see. So just so we're all clear on who the players are, first up is Tulsi Gabbard. If you don't know, she's the director of DNI. Now, DNI is Director of National Intelligence. Post 9/11, we had this forensic look at what went wrong with 9/11, why we didn't see it coming, why we were slow to react. We had a lot of hearings. This is all public knowledge, and I don't want to rehash the past. Out of all of that, it was decided that all of the disparate intelligence community organizations would funnel up to the Director of National Intelligence. And this individual's responsibility would be to distill all of this information and decide what was actionable and where it should go for said action. The post is also directly responsible for making sure that the president and decision makers in Congress have current information on the U.S. state of intelligence, foreign threats, domestic, because they involve a lot of different intelligence organizations. In fact, all of them under one roof. Okay. So Tulsi Gabbard is currently the DNI. She sits at the head of the National Intelligence. She has said that the intelligence community provides input, but only the president determines whether a threat is imminent. Her words, not mine. She has said that the United States and Israel's war aims in Iran differ. This conflicts with her earlier confirmation hearing framing that, and I quote, direct and imminent threat is a meaningful threshold tied to notification and oversight. Also sits uneasily besides reporting on her written statement about no rebuild effort after prior strikes. So things that she said and things that she is saying are directly contradictory. Next up, you have John Radcliffe. He's the CIA director. I don't think I have to explain to you who that is and what that individual does. Publicly, he takes a much harder line. He says that Iran was a constant and immediate threat. His statements prior and now tighten alignment with White House war rhetoric, but exposes a visible difference with Gabbard's refusal to publicly validate that same threshold. Also testifying alongside the aforementioned was Kash Patel, the FBI director. He was present in the hearings, but less central in the public Iran war contradiction record. No strong publicly documented Iran-specific contradiction surfaced in any of the material I was able to find for this segment. He was just kind of there. Some of the other players not directly testifying but important to the discussion are Joe Kent. He is the former National Counterterrorism Center director. He just recently resigned. That in and of itself is a big story considering the letter that he publicly laid on Trump's desk. He has said that Iran posed no imminent threat. His resignation, it kind of validates that this is not just partisan theater. There is internal dispute over the threshold for war. He was one of Trump's picks. He was part of his inner circle. So his dissent and resignation is, in a lot of ways, fairly telling. You also have Joe Kent. Nope, sorry. I got ahead of myself on my notes. Okay, so we talked about him. You also have President Trump himself. He has publicly gone on record in saying that the rationale for the war in Iran centers on imminent threat. The United States objectives that he has framed as destroying Iranian ballistic missile capability and Iranian Navy. If the international community, if the intelligence community will not publicly own the imminence judgment, and they haven't in some ways, they have in others, the president is left standing on a very politically useful but evidentiary fragile claim. You also have Israel, our partner, or at least our co-belligerent. They're mostly focused on degrading Iranian leadership, per Tulsi Gabbard's House testimony. But they have very divergent aims, which can increase a lot of the escalation risk and a lot of reduced message coherence. It's obvious that Israel's aims in Iran and our aims in Iran are different. And that's causing a lot of problems. It's an issue for Israel domestically. It's an issue for the United States domestically as far as messaging goes. But it's also a problem when you're working with a partner and you each have different end states. We're both conducting joint military operations against Iran. And if we don't share what the target set is, what the end state is, what victory looks like, that can be a serious problem. These hearings that took place on Capitol Hill, they're exposing a credibility fracture. It's more than just a messaging problem. So you had the administration's public casus belli, which was an imminent threat. Tulsi Gabbard would not publicly say the intelligence community assessed that threshold. Instead, she has said only the president determines imminence. Radcliffe leaned harder toward imminent threat language. Kash Patel, as I said, present, but not the strongest public contradictions. Those sit with Gabbard and Radcliffe, not him. So the result of all of this is this widening gap between policy justification, intelligence presentation, and congressional oversight. Let's go through the timeline on a lot of this, and I think it's going to help so that we can see how we got to where we are now. Let's go back to January 2025. The event was Tulsi Gabbard's confirmation hearing. In written responses, Gabbard said the DNI must keep Congress fully and currently informed, and that by bypassing notice entirely would require extraordinary circumstances such as a direct and imminent threat, her words. This establishes her prior standard. This is why it's important. She said imminence has legal and oversight significance. Now let's go to February 28th of this year. You had a U.S. and Israel air assault on Iran begins per Reuters hearing coverage. This is the operational start point for this whole current justification fight. Move to March 18th. You had a Senate Intelligence Committee worldwide threats hearing where Gabbard said only the president determines whether a threat is imminent. That's not what she said prior. Axios reports she did not say the intelligence community assessed an imminent Iranian nuclear threat, while Radcliffe said Iran posed an immediate threat. So here's where this core contradiction cycle becomes public. That same hearing cycle, reporting notes of tension between Gabbard's written position that Iran's enrichment capability had been obliterated with no rebuild effort, and her live framing that Iran intended to recover and rebuild. Two totally different things. It suggests selective emphasis in a live testimony. That same day, Senate blocks a war powers resolution aimed at checking continued military action in Iran. Congress signals political reluctance by doing this to constrain the war despite all evidentiary ambiguity. The next day, March 19th, the House Intelligence Committee hearing where Gabbard says the United States and Israel's war aims are not the same. She says the United States' objectives is Iran's ballistic missile and navy. Israel, meanwhile, is focused on Iranian leadership. She again says only Trump determines imminence. She's confirmed that Allied objective divergence and repeats the same legal intelligence dodge. Same day, March 19th. Our friends over at Reuters reports that Tulsi Gabbard says the intelligence community has high confidence it knows the location of Iran's highly enriched uranium stockpile, but has declined to discuss in public whether the U.S. could destroy it. From what I have read, their stockpile of enriched uranium is deep underground. Satellite coverage has pinned it down. It's being watched with redundant systems to see if it's possible that it comes to the surface, is divided, and dispersed, which would be On Iran's part, the strategic move. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. But because, and again, open source reporting, it is so deeply underground, you're going to have to almost assuredly put troops on the ground, whether that's Israeli or U.S. forces remains to be seen. Could we destroy it? It's not beyond the realm of possibility with a whole lot of those large penetrators we used last year to hit their manufacturing facilities, but you would never have a confirmed battle damage assessment without putting somebody on the ground, or possibly IAEA if they're willing to do a BDA, and they might. But this uranium issue is still an unresolved issue strategically, despite all of our tactical damage claims. There's a few issues that are going on here when we talk about this casus belli. If you look at the witnesses on Capitol Hill, those who have testified, the administration, and where that line is, what is the public evidentiary reserve, if you will, there is a imminent assessment threat. It existed. The White House says yes. Tulsi Gabbard, however, refuses to say that the intelligence community made that determination, while Radcliffe says Iran posed an immediate threat. That's weak to mixed signaling, and the biggest vulnerability there is public proof remains really, really thin, and the witness language between Tulsi Gabbard and Radcliffe are not aligned. Neither is the intelligence community. The next point of contention is Iran's nuclear infrastructure was severely degraded last year. So Gabbard's written posture and the wider reporting really on the whole indicate the prior strikes heavily damaged or obliterated the enrichment capability. A lot of this says that it was actually a moderate tactical degradation that appears credible. Iran is rebuilding, or at least intends to rebuild, is the party line that justified what we're doing now. Gabbard, in a live testimony, emphasized recovery and reconstitution intent. While ATA states Iran intended to recover from devastation to the nuclear infrastructure and had missile and WMD ambitions prior to Epic Fury, the moderate and long-term threat here case is now stronger than the imminent now case. Here's another one. The U.S. and Israel are operating under one clean common strategy. That's the stated thing, publicly anyways, but that is not what Tulsi Gabbard just testified a couple of days ago on the Hill. She said that the objectives are not the same. This is visibly false and in the open record. Okay. Congress was adequately postured for oversight. Okay. Gabbard's prior written standards stressed full and current information with only narrow exceptions. Remember her statement during confirmation hearings? Well, that's questionable these days because oversight legitimacy is really now part of the whole conflict itself. You have this big contradiction table. Current posture, operational meaning. Who determines imminence? Gabbard's confirmation responses treated direct and imminent threat as a very meaningful threshold tied to extraordinary action and notification logic to Congress. Gabbard says only the president now determines imminence, not the intelligence community. I get it. He is the commander-in-chief, and it is where the buck stops. But in your confirmation hearing, you put a lot of gravity and weight on the intelligence community and your role as the DNI to brief Congress in the constitutionally appointed roles that Congress has and the president has. So it seems like you are now changing your position on that, which I suppose you're allowed to do. You can evolve, but it's this ambiguity that we shouldn't be having right now when it comes to the conflict in Iran. And I want to be absolutely clear. What I'm doing is I am simply laying out the facts and making an argument. It is up to you to determine whether you agree or don't agree. I am not giving you my opinion on whether I feel that our current conflict with Iran is morally and ethically justified. That's not what this is doing. This is an argument about the facts as they were and as they currently are moving forward. So the state of Iran's nuclear recovery. Reporting on Gabbard's written statement says prior attacks last year obliterated the enrichment, and there's been no rebuild effort since. Okay? Well, live testimony emphasized intention to recover and rebuild rather than the absence of a rebuild effort, which blurs a fact that weakens this urgency case. If your whole justification was they're urgently rebuilding their nuclear capability, but yet you said that it was completely destroyed last year, those two facts cannot exist at the same time. This blurs a fact that weakens the urgency case. Talk about alliance war aims between us and Israel. Public messaging emphasized very close U.S. and Israel coordination. But yet Gabbard says the U.S. and Israeli objectives are not the same. And this indicates a very dangerous strategic divergence under a shared campaign. Let's look at some of the risks and the probability of those risks, and then why it matters. The risk of credibility collapsing over the war rationale, I think it's pretty high. I think the impact of it is pretty high. Why? Because if imminence cannot be publicly substantiated, then every later setback gets read as a war sold on a weak predicate. Remember 2003, we went into Iraq and we invaded on a premise of WMDs. Now, opinion time, and I'm letting you know it's my opinion. I still think that going into Iraq in 2003 was a just war. I do. I walked to the ground. I talked to the people. I saw the results of what Saddam's regime did to its people. And yeah, he was a bastard and probably needed to go. Totally think we could have done it differently. 110% should have done it differently, but justified? Yes. Was I righteously indignant because there were no WMDs and the whole war was launched on pretty flimsy justifications? No, I wasn't. I'm a realist. I was also a Marine. Really? Didn't bother me a whole lot. Should it have? I don't know. Maybe. It can bother you if you'd like. But today, with Iran, as I said, if we cannot substantiate imminence, then every failure moving forward is going to be, and I told you so. All right, next risk. Mission creep because of this divergent U.S. and Israel aim. I think the impact is high, and I think the probability is high. And it matters because if Israel targets the regime and the leadership, while Washington claims a much narrower military aim, then we have this huge escalation control friction. Congressional oversight erosion. Medium to high probability. The impact is high, and it's high because Gabbard's prior oversight commitments now are colliding directly with this evasive public testimony, weakly bounded executive discretion. The risk of Iran reconstitution over time. Medium to high probability. Impact even higher, because even severe tactical degradation does not equal strategic elimination. And the ATA language supports recovery intent, by the way. Next risk, retaliatory or proxy blowback. Impact, medium high, probability is also high. Both Reuters and ATA point to continuing Iranian and allied actor capacity for a lot of asymmetric retaliation, regardless of how many targets we take out. Domestic political fracture inside the national security apparatus. Likelihood, medium. Impact, medium to medium high. Look at Joe Kent's resignation. It indicates the dispute is internal. It's not just partisan. Remember, Joe Kent was one of his own. The bottom line in all of this hearing cycle, it didn't strengthen the war case. If anything, it narrowed it. The strongest publicly defensible claim is Iran remains a long-term danger with potential reconstitution. The weakest claim is the administration had a clean, publicly supportable, imminent threat predicate for war. And that gap is where this whole structure is now cracking. All right. Considering all of that, I want to do a quick analysis of Operation Epic Fury. A lot of this discussion is going to be home-based. You can watch the news to find out what's blowing up and what's going bang. Currently, the administration's logic, as I just talked about, is not internally clean. It's shifting between really three different claims and hoping the public treats them as one. The first claim, Midnight Hammer, already wrecked Iran's core enrichment infrastructure. You go back to June of last year, the Pentagon said the strikes were designed to severely degrade Iran's nuclear weapons infrastructure. And senior leaders later described Fordow and another site as destroyed. Iran's nuclear efforts set back by years. Epic Fury is justified because Iran still must be denied nuclear weapons forever. And I absolutely agree with that. But since late February and early March, the White House, both with the War Department messaging, has framed Epic Fury as a laser focused on destroying missiles, naval power, and ensuring Iran will never have nuclear weapons or permanently deny Iran nuclear weapons forever. Both of those are direct quotes, by the way. But the actual verification picture is still incomplete. The IAEA says it still has unresolved questions. It has not verified the current inventory of Iran's HEU, LEU, after months without having access. It has not conducted verification at the attacked facilities. And as of March 18th, at least, it still does not know the status of these new underground enrichment facilities at Isfahan? Yeah, I think that's the place. Reuters reports Grossi saying inspectors have not yet been able to determine whether those underground sites are empty, whether they're prepared for centrifuges, or they're already partially equipped. So here's the hard truth. Quote, we obliterated their refining and enrichment ability, and we must launch another campaign so they can't get a bomb. I'm sorry. Those are only compatible if the second argument means prevention of regeneration, not elimination of an active near-term nuclear breakout capability. To me, the administration is blurring that distinction on purpose. I think this is what is actually happening. I think the current official line about Epic Fury, it's broader than nuclear. I think the White House and the War Department are publicly defining the operation as a campaign against Iran's missiles, missile production, Navy, and a broader security apparatus. And we, in last week's broadcast, laid out the minimal and maximal criteria for victory, both with the United States, Iran, and Israel, and what losses look across the board. So the administration stating missile production, Navy, and security apparatus while repeatedly attaching the nuclear rationale as the moral and strategic umbrella. I mean, nuclear proliferation, it may be the banner. Regime military degradation is the operational reality. And that matters because if Midnight Hammer last year truly removed the immediate enrichment backbone, then Epic Fury is not best understood as a discrete counterproliferation strike. It's a follow-on coercive war campaign meant to exploit Iran's weakened state, destroy their delivery systems, and prevent reconstitution. Oh, and force a new regional order under U.S. and Israel military dominance, which, if I was to offer an opinion, I hate to frame it this way because it's really pat, but Iran kind of had it coming. I mean, responsible, at least by proxy, for the Beirut bombings. They took over the embassy in Tehran and held Americans for 444 days. They were at least funding the coal bombing. I mean, there is thousands of U.S. citizens dead by their hands. I'm by no means trying to suggest that, they're not deserving of a massive punch in the balls. But a lot of what I do here is in this discussion is I give you critical thinking. I'm giving you an argument that's supported by facts, that is documented and grounded in reality. I am not trying to give spin or bias or personal opinion unless I specifically call it out. So, all that to be said, the nuclear line, it's the cleanest public justification. But the target set reveals a much larger objective. And this contradiction exists because, quote, Iran can't have nuclear weapons, and that's politically durable, legally more defensible than naked regime change language, emotionally legible to allies and domestic audiences, but there's a gap between that slogan and the available evidence. Remember, the Pentagon in June 2025 talked about Midnight Hammer as severely degrading or destroying key facilities. Current administration rhetoric says Midnight Hammer set the condition for epic fury. Yet the IAEA still cannot conclusively verify these inventories, can't verify the facility status, or the condition of the new underground Isfahan, God bless America, Isfahan site. I'm going to take a course in Farsi. That's next up on the list. All this means the administration, they can argue residual risk forever because incomplete verification leaves no permanent room for threats. If you can't independently confirm that you've done what you've said you've done, then you leave the door open for an endless and permanent threat. And I'm just laying out the facts. Not a big fan of PBS, but they and others have reported that lawmakers are pressing intelligence officials on whether this imminent threat case was overstated or inconsistent with a lot of our prior U.S. assessments. It doesn't mean that the administration is lying. It just shows that the official justification is under serious strain. All right. That was a lot. What do I think it means? What do I think it implies? Well, I think first, the mission has expanded from rollback to denial of reconstitution. And that's a very different war. It is not about smashing 3 sites and going home. It's about keeping Iran too broken to recover militarily or technically. And I think it's going to work. I think we're going to meet our stated aims, but I don't think it is going to be achieved the way that we are thinking it's going to be achieved. And I think there's going to be some second and third order effects. Secondly, this verification failure becomes a lot of strategy fuel. The IAEA's lack of access and this unresolved accounting on enriched material, they don't just create uncertainty. They create a standing justification for continued strikes, for pressure, for escalation. In other words, ambiguity is operationally useful here. I think third, The true concern may be less uranium production than weaponization, latency plus delivery systems, really. Even if enrichment facilities over there are heavily damaged, our focus seems to be on missiles and missile production, which suggests it's treating the danger as the combination of residual fissile potential, underground rebuild capacity, and I guess a deliverable strike system. And that's why the rhetoric wields missiles and nuke denial into one package. I think fourth, this weakens the administration's narrow casus belli, even if the broader strategic logic remains real. A state can rationally argue that Iran must be prevented from rebuilding a nuclear weapon. Got it. But that's not the same thing as proving an imminent nuclear threat, which justified launching Epic Fury, when officials are also saying prior strikes already obliterated the key infrastructure. Are you hearing me here? That mismatch, that's what critics are attacking. And I can totally understand why. Stick to the message. The strongest evidence on the nuclear status quo question comes from the IAEA. Oh, and Reuters, both reporting on Ghazi, not from complete on-site verification. Some current political reporting is also reflecting very strong adversarial framing around these hearings, and they're going to, in many cases, overstate certainty. I think the safest conclusion is not the administration's lying or their case is false. I think the administration is compressing several threat categories into one slogan because it gives the administration great freedom of action. So, that being said, I want to continue. I want to continue with the domestic angle on this conflict. You ready for this one? Let's look at what the cost of Operation Epic Fury is currently at. If you've not been to Washington, D.C., there's a deficit clock. It's this huge digital display that shows what the U.S. deficit currently is. Don't go see it. Don't do it. Stay far away from it. It's horribly depressing. And they're going to have to add another digit to it. On the left-hand side, it's not moving very fast, but if you go to the right-hand side, and oh, by the way, it has enough digits for 8 trillion. The right-hand side is spinning so fast you can't even see it. And I think we just added to it. Again, I am not making a case against what we're doing in Iran. I personally feel they had it coming. There was a cleaner way to do it, in my opinion, but I am not saying that they don't deserve it. But I'm going to point out the facts. And here's one of them. March 18th. As of March 18th, the cleanest numbers that I have been able to find is the cost of this conflict is probably costing the United States somewhere between, okay, you ready? Roughly 600 million and 1 billion per day. That's right now, and that's on a running basis. The opening phase alone burning closer to 1.9 billion per day. The hard official style number we have is that the first 6 days cost at least 11.3 billion, which works out to about 1.88 billion per day. Now, a later White House official figure put the total at about 12 billion by mid-March. You spread that over February 28th to March 18th. That's where I came up with the rough average of 630 million per day. They're not contradictory. They just imply an initial spike and then a lower but still brutal burn rate. That being said, anyone giving you a neat daily number is kind of selling certainty they don't have. The 11.3 billion figure was given to lawmakers, and it did not include the full cost of the war. Reuters is where I'm getting a chunk of this information from. They reported that number from a closed-door briefing and explicitly noted it's not the entire cost. Reporting on that briefing says it was heavily driven by munitions, including $5.6 billion in munitions in just the first 2 days. So the other real costs are probably incomplete or outside of that top line. So the best working estimate is opening shock phase running somewhere around 1.9 billion per day based on the first 6 days. The early follow-on phase, congressional briefings are saying that spending had fallen from roughly 2 billion per day to around 1 billion as the U.S. shifted from more expensive weapon mixes to cheaper JDAM heavy strike packages. Yeah, those cruise missiles, those Tomahawks, those T-LAMs, those bitches are expensive. Once a lot of their air threat is gone and we have air dominance, we can usually shift towards lower cost ordinances and in some cases, naval gunfire. Israel is, obviously conducting their own strike package, but these numbers don't take any of that into account. The campaign to date average through mid-March, right around 0.6 billion a day. And I'm basing that off the administration's roughly 12 billion so far figured. Now, the real bill in all of this is probably higher than all of those if you count what matters in war rather than what's just easy to brief. Things like replacement of depleted missile stocks, accelerated procurement, base damage repair, carrier and air wing operating tempo, the deployment costs, the long-tail medical and veterans cost, and, of course, the debt service on the money used to finance it. So this is a lot of money, like a fuckload of money. So how are we paying for it? Well, right now the U.S. appears to be paying for the war in 3 distinct layers. First, through existing Pentagon appropriations and a lot of existing stockpiles. That's typically what's used up first. That's the initial mechanism. You're going to use already funded O&M, munition inventories, deployment authorities, and a lot of contingency flexibility already inside the defense budget, right? So we're still within, purple dollars. Public administration comments this month indicate the White House line was essentially, we're using existing resources for now. Second line of funding is through a upcoming supplemental appropriation. Reuters reported yesterday that the Pentagon has asked the White House to approve a request to Congress, because Congress owns the purse, for more than $200 billion just for the Iran war. Earlier reporting said congressional aides expected an additional request with some discussion around $50 billion just as an initial number. So that tells you that the current financing method is not viewed as sustainable, at least from inside the building. We're burning a lot. If you calculate the amount of strikes that have been conducted, whether they're smart munitions, genius munitions, or dumb munitions, that it costs money. The planes launching them, the ships that launch the planes, the sailors that fly, the airmen, pilots that fly the planes, and so on and so forth. Third line of funding, and this is the part politicians are probably hiding through the fog, is federal borrowing. The Treasury is already financing a government running very large deficits. And it said in February that it expected to borrow $574 billion in net marketable debt between January and March of this year alone. $109 billion through April and June of this year. The Congressional Budget Office's own numbers for February outlook projected a $1.9 trillion federal deficit for fiscal year 2026 and about a $1 trillion in net interest outlays this year alone. What does that mean? Even if Congress pays for the war legislatively, the cash reality is still largely debt financed unless offset elsewhere. And there isn't, because there's no sign of that ever happening. If you have ever taken a course in civics or government 101 and you understand discretionary spending, it used to be discretionary spending was the bulk of the budget. Now it's the minority. We're spending more than we can ever possibly repay, and we're kicking that can so far down the road. So many social programs, so many things. I mean, the last time we had a balanced budget was under the Clinton administration, for fuck's sake. All right, I gave some opinion there, and I said I would be cautious about that. What does all this imply? This is the part that I want you to understand. You look at the daily burn rate, the numbers that I'm giving, but you're missing the strategic ledger, and that's what I want you to understand. This is where I get a little fussy, because this war is not just costing us bombs. It's costing us readiness. Reuters has reported that lawmakers were already worried the campaign would deplete U.S. stocks when the defense industrial base was already strained. And I want to point something out at this moment. I have heard comments from some of you that have said something to the effect of, if we want to make more, we're totally capable of making more. No, we're not. No, we're not, dude. No, we're not. If you're playing bingo, put an X in the square because I'm giving you this one. The military-industrial complex is at peak production capacity. We can't fucking make more. We can't. We're not on a wartime footing. This isn't World War II. Our economy is not centered around Rosie the Riveter going and making tomahawks. We would need new factories, workers, trained, skilled technicians to work in said factories. We don't have it. The production capacity isn't there. Can we buy from foreign sources? Sure we can. Yeah, absolutely. Is that smart? No, not really. Not when it comes to something as strategic as some of these missile stockpiles. This reason and this reason alone is why this burn rate matters more than the money that I've quoted you. Money can be appropriated much faster than tomahawks, interceptors, and precision kits can be manufactured. We can deficit spend another $1 trillion, but you cannot make these factories and assembly lines produce these products to wage war any faster than they already are in the time that we need them. The other thing I want you to understand is the public fiscal cost is only half of the story. The consumer cost, we're going to talk about that next, is arriving through energy. The Associated Press reporting U.S. gas prices rose from about $2.98 before February 28th to over $3.84 a gallon by March 18th, with Brent above $108 a barrel. This is a shadow war tax on households, trucking, food, and inflation. You are paying at the pump while the Treasury pays at auction. The old expression of, we can fund it later, that is a lie. The government already projected to run a $1.9 trillion deficit. Does not fight an open-ended regional war for free. It either cuts elsewhere, taxes more, or borrows more. Politically, borrowing is the path of least resistance, and that seems to be what we have done over and over and over again. Strategically, that means you have a much higher future interest rate burden. You have less fiscal room for a Pacific contingency, less recession response, or, God forbid, a domestic crisis. The Pentagon asking for more than $200 billion is the loudest signal on the board. This is not a mop-up signal. That is a sign the department sees this as a campaign with serious duration, replenishment, and force generation consequences. So whether Congress grants the full amount, that's another question. And really not even the big statement. It's the request itself, saying that the war is no longer being treated as a short raid financed from couch cushions or Department of War internal budgets. The most dangerous number, it's not the daily cost. It's the uncapped cost. If this war remains a strike campaign with very limited escalation, the fiscal damage is heavy, but it's manageable. It is manageable. If this conflict with Iran turns into sustained suppression of Iranian missile capacity, these escort operations we're now banding about in and around Hormuz, more basing requirements in the region, more maritime security, all the while replenishment at industrial scale, then the cost jumps from expensive operation to budget shaping war. And that is the razor edge that the United States is now walking. So just to kind of bookend this subject, the hard numbers are really supporting this. Remember, the opening phase, 1.9 billion per day. The current campaign average is running at about 0.6 billion a day. But the likely real present burn is probably closer to somewhere between 0.6 billion and 1 billion, with the all-in cost, once this whole thing is done, replenishment, op tempo, and borrowing, I can't calculate it. The United States is first paying out of Pentagon accounts. We talked about that, and using existing inventories now. But we're using our next likely emergency supplemental cash as well. And I mean cash in two ways, cash and cachet. Ultimately, all of this is going to be through more federal debt layered onto an already swollen deficit. And the implication about all of this is very simple and it's very ugly. This is not just a war bill. This is a readiness bill. It's an inflation bill. And it's a future interest bill. I did the best that I could with a lot of these numbers. The public figures, they're still incomplete. And really, they don't take into account the troop deployment cost, the healthcare, the equipment replacement, which we're not really even getting a handle on. We're talking about burn rates through missiles, but we have no idea when all of these aircraft and naval ships and the MEU come home, what the cost is on replacing just the normal burn rate of equipment. So the long tail veterans costs is another thing. We'll see. A lot of these numbers could change based off anything that happens in the last 24 hours because this was all calculated about 48 hours ago and the campaign is still evolving. It's depressing as fuck if you ask me. Speaking of which, let's talk about another very depressing subject, and that's the cost of gas. Domestically, gas is climbing, and a lot of other sectors are going to climb as well because gas may be the immediate, but the second and third order of high petroleum products are rippled throughout, pretty much everything. Everything. I did not fully appreciate the gas price increases until very recently while researching for this story. And in order to understand this story, I had to understand the EIA, which heretofore I really knew practically nothing about. You can go over to their website if you want, but you're not going to like it. Their own website says that their charter is as the Energy Information Administration, or EIA. They collect, analyze, and disseminate independent and impartial energy information to promote sound policymaking, efficient markets, and public understanding of energy and its interaction with the economy and the environment. Yeah, trust me, the rest of their website isn't any easier to read. But I got a lot of information from them. Okay, so currently the White House's line, which is Iranian oil is sold everywhere, is sold elsewhere, and does not directly fuel U.S. consumption. It's factually narrow, and it's also strategically evasive because oil is a global pricing system and not a patriotic bucket brigade. And I had to learn all of this in a very short amount of time. So I'll try to explain it the best that I can. The United States can avoid buying a single Iranian barrel of oil and still get hit hard at the pump because crude, the shipping of crude, the insurance for the shipping, and the refinery feedstocks, and the market expectations, all of them reprice off global disruption. So the EIA says gasoline prices generally track crude prices, and crude is the largest component of retail gasoline prices. So this present spike that we're having right now, it's being driven by war risk pricing, a lot of disrupted Gulf energy infrastructure, and obviously these impaired flows through the Strait of Hormuz. The EIA says that roughly 20 million barrels per day go through the Strait. That's based off 2024. That is equal, by the way, to about 20% of global petroleum liquid consumption, about a quarter of the global seaborne oil trade. And that is why an Iran-centered conflict raises prices in the United States, even if we don't get a drop of oil from Iran. There is a real sanction enforcement and maritime interdiction link between Iran and Venezuela. The Department of Justice's February 27th forfeiture case over the tanker Skipper and that 1.8 million barrels of Venezuelan crude explicitly alleged support to an Iran-linked sanction evasion network. But there's not enough public evidence to prove that the Venezuelan seizure was a deliberate energy market precursor to war with Iran. It's more defensible to say it fits a broader campaign of tightening maritime enforcement against a lot of hostile oil networks. I apologize. My voice is still pretty sore. I am soothing it with a lovely porter, though. Don't worry. So what happens now? Oil markets, as I'm sure you are aware, are reacting to this physical disruption, but also a fear of further disruption. Reuters has reported on the 19th of March that Brent briefly rose above $119 a barrel, and WTI touched about 100 after Iran attacks on some energy infrastructure in the region. Reuters has also reported that the U.S. average gasoline has moved above $3.75 a gallon as far as recent as the 17th of March. And as you know, prices are sharply up since the U.S. conflict with Iran started. The U.S. government's own outlook has said that crude prices had surged because petroleum shipments through the Hormuz had fallen and some Middle Eastern production had been shut. So in other words, the official data already contradict the simplest political line. All right, that's great. But let's get into it with a little more topical detail. Why U.S. gas prices rise, even if the U.S. doesn't consume any Iranian oil? Okay, there's a couple of reasons. One, as I said, oil is globally priced, and this is really the core mechanism. U.S. gasoline prices are not set only by the United States domestic production. They are shaped by benchmark crude prices, refining economics, bottlenecks in transport, current inventories, and trader expectations. EIA says that, they're very explicit that crude oil is the largest component of retail gasoline prices. The United States could actually produce all of its oil needs domestically. We have the capacity. What we don't have are the refineries. Some of our refineries are designed for certain types of fuels. Other refineries are designed for other types of fuels. We do not have enough refineries to process the fuel that we need the most. So we have to bring it in. So we are, unfortunately, at the mercy of the domestic market. Could we rely entirely on domestic? Yeah. Why haven't we? Yeah. Good question. NIMBY, the old acronym, not in my backyard. Nobody wants a fucking refinery in their backyard. I don't literally mean in your backyard. This is not an episode of the Beverly Hillbillies. What I'm saying is nobody wants to live 2 miles, 3 miles, 4 miles down from a refinery. No senator or congressperson is ever going to vote for that in their district. Nobody wants it. No one has issued a new permit for a refinery in I don't know how long. It's probably available on the internet. I just didn't look it up for this story. So we're stuck. We're stuck. Domestic oil, we need it. Foreign oil, we need it. And as such, we are impacted by the global price of oil. Hormuz is not just Iran's problem. It's the market's main jugular. The EIA says Hormuz carried about 20 million barrels per day in 24, 20.9 million barrels per day in first quarter of 25, and around 1/5 of the world petroleum liquids consumption. So a disruption there does not merely threaten Iranian exports, it threatens flows from Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, UAE, Qatar, and all associated LNG traffic, liquefied natural gas. The United States exports oil, but it doesn't insulate us from U.S. drivers. The EIA reports on March 10th that the United States crude exports in 2025 were about 4 million barrels per day, but the U.S. still remained a net crude importer with net imports of 2.2 million barrels per day in 2025. More importantly, domestic barrels are priced within a global arbitrage system. Reuters noted this week that the WTI Brent discount widened to the largest in 11 years, which actually encourages more U.S. exports. So when global prices surge, domestic consumers still get squeezed. Refiners and product markets care about the grade, the logistics, and the replacement cost. And this is where public messaging usually collapses into slogans. The market is not asking, does America buy Iranian oil? It is asking, what does it cost to replace disrupted medium sour barrels? What does it cost to insure these tankers, to secure shipping lanes, and to keep these refineries supplied? That replacement cost gets embedded into wholesale and retail fuel prices. Both Reuters and the IAE describe this broad market disruption. It's not a narrow Iran-only export issue. The reserve numbers matter, but they're not magic. The Department of Energy has said the Strategic Petroleum Reserve held about 416 million barrels as of March 4th, 2026, so this year. Maximum nominal drawdown capacity of 4.4 million barrels per day and about 13 days for oil to enter the U.S. market after the president makes a decision to release some of those strategic oil reserves. The IEA announced on March 11th that member countries would make 400 million barrels available for emergency reserves. And this is the largest collective action in history. But days later, the IEA said this was only a buffer and that real stabilization still depends on restoring shipping through the Strait of Hormuz. So what this means is that the reserve system can buy time. It can certainly damp panic, but you're not going to permanently replace a major prolonged Gulf disruption. So whether we like it or not, Iran matters. It's not the end buyer. EIA's Iran export analysis and the China brief indicate China has absorbed the overwhelming majority of Iranian crude growth. About 90% of China's imports from Iran go to independent refineries. The Iranian barrels are therefore part of the global supply matrix. If they're threatened, displaced, sanctioned harder, or physically interrupted, then buyers globally have to compete for replacement barrels elsewhere, and that raises the whole curve. That's why we're paying more gas here in America. Because the loss of Iranian oil is a market problem that we all have to find market sources elsewhere. You remember your high school economics class, supply and demand and supply. It's actually demand supplied, but if there is less available quantity globally, it's going to raise the price globally. And that means the oil that the United States imports, which I just told you is a decent amount, it's going to go up. And that gets passed on to you. That gets passed on to you, the consumer. Have I mentioned I drive an electric car? Yeah, I do. Has the cost of charging gone up for me yet? Not yet. This whole thing that I've just explained is the part that politicians avoid because oftentimes it ruins this comforting soundbite. And then let's look at this one real quick. Is there a strategic link to the Venezuelan seizure? Maybe. The Department of Justice announced on February 27th, the U.S. sought forfeiture of that skipper tanker that we took over and its 1.8 million barrels of Venezuelan crude. DOJ said the case involved a sanctions evasion network that supposedly supported Iran and its IRGC. This likely means that there's a visible enforcement overlap between Venezuelan and Iranian oil sanctions evasion networks. So that overlap, it gives Washington this pre-existing operational basis to target shipping and financing and cargo movements that are tied to both Iran and Venezuela. That's what's proven. What is not proven? There's no authoritative public evidence that I could find that shows the Venezuelan seizure was specifically designed as some kind of a pre-war shaping move for this later Iran conflict. That claim, I think it's tempting, but it's not proof. So right now, I think the stronger conclusion is that that seizure was part of a broader escalation in maritime enforcement. It may have improved our leverage going into a wider confrontation with Iran, but I think that distinction matters. I should be drinking Guinness this close to St. Patrick's Day. The IMF, the International Monetary Fund, warned yesterday, that if the energy price increase persists for a year, it's going to add about 0.4 percentage points to the global inflation. It's going to cut output by about 2 points, 0.2 points. Reuters also reports the oil spike is pushing out expectations for Fed rate cuts. So all of this translates into fuel shock, becomes monetary policy shock, and then consumer demand shock. There's this big United States policy contradiction right now because Washington appears to be doing two things at once. On the one hand, it's trying to suppress the consumer pain with strategic oil release, with waivers. Yeah, we talked about those waivers with Russia, and emergency coordination. Asking a lot of our allies to release some of their strategic reserves. Washington is also trying to constrict sanction network oil flows tied to Iran and Venezuela. I think this is strategically understandable, but it's economically contradictory. You cannot squeeze a hostile supply network and expect no price increases unless replacement barrels arrive really, really fast. U.S. export posture, it cuts both ways. Reuters has reported the WTI Brent spread. It's making U.S. exports more attractive because we can offer a pretty decent supply. And this helps a lot of our allies and a lot of the global supply balancing. But it still means that here in America, our gas prices are still exposed to world pricing. Energy dominance, it's not consumer insulation. So what do I see as the best possible case here? Well, I think best plausible case is Hormuz traffic partially normalizes. The strategic reserve barrels flowing into consumers somewhat calm the panic. I think a lot of this damaged oil refineries and the infrastructure, it's repaired quickly, and the cost of Brent retreats materially from some of these crisis high. I think U.S. gas prices are still going to stay elevated, but hopefully we can keep it from spiraling. Base case, I would say prices remain elevated and volatile. Even partial shipping restoration leaves still a war premium. Even if tomorrow the Strait of Hormuz was declared completely open, safe, do you honestly think that the underwriters are going to go back to a pre-wartime insurance footing? I don't. You're still going to have higher insurance costs. You're still going to have a constrained regional output, and this is still going to mean higher U.S. gas and diesel probably for weeks, months, really. I would anticipate this goes into the summer, and summer gas prices are always higher anyways. Worst case, you have sustained attacks on a lot of the Gulf production facilities, natural gas terminals, ports, or some of these tankers that are hauling oil, and they keep a lot of volume offline. I think the IEA says nearly 200 million barrels per day of crude and product exports are currently being disrupted with very limited alternatives. So in that environment, reserve releases, they blunt the shock, but they're not going to solve it. I think if inflation worsens, freight rises, recession risks rise, I think the administration's argument is a very narrow legal truth. It's a very bad market explanation. I think the U.S. does not need to import Iranian oil to suffer high gas prices. The reason gas prices are higher, it's simple and brutal. Global crude benchmarks are repricing because a major share of the world's oil go through the Strait of Hormuz, and that strait is under threat. And I think that's enough. The Venezuelan seizure, it's completely irrelevant, but it does show the U.S. was already contesting Iran and Venezuelan-linked oil networks. And that may have been pressure building. I don't know. It may have been routine escalation. Publicly available evidence that I've been able to cobble together doesn't prove it was a deliberate precursor to the Iranian war, but we'll find out. U.S. gas prices, they're higher. They're going to stay higher. Oil's globally priced. We import oil. Hormuz disruption, it threatens 1/5 of all world petroleum liquid flows. And the market is reacting. They are pricing replacement risks, shipping risks, inflation risks. So, yeah. Are you depressed yet? As I said, I wanted to keep the Iranian conflict pretty much domestically impacted. I'm not so much super concerned about Israel hitting some senior leaders in the regime. It's interesting, but it's not as topical as, oh, hey, I'm paying a shitload of money for fuel, or I'm seeing the price of vegetables go up, or I'm seeing the price of shipping go up. This is why. I also wanted to talk, as I said, about the disparate public face of the war on Capitol Hill, what is being publicly put out in press releases from the White House, what is truth, what is not, and what lies in between. Okay. So I want to talk about one final story before we are all depressed to the point of day drinking. In my case, too late. I have a little bit left though, so we're not done talking yet. I like to end on a high note, if possible. I think this story shows a high note to me. I think this story shows that Putin may be losing some loyalty. I wanted to also highlight the rolling blackouts that are over there and why it may have been happening, but I'm going to probably save that for next week. That story's not going anywhere. A fascinating story about the internet being selectively turned off in Russia and why I think that's the case. We'll talk about that in the next edition. So multiple reports on the 18th of March say Ilya Remyslio, a longtime Kremlin-aligned lawyer, he's also a blogger. He's very well known for attacking Alexei Navalny and a lot of other regime critics of Putin. A couple of days ago, he posts to his Telegram channel, which has about 90,000 subscribers, that essentially Putin should resign and be tried as a war criminal. The title of his post was 5 Reasons Why I Stopped Supporting Vladimir Putin. His whole diatribe, letter, manifesto, it's out there on the internet. You can find a translation. It's interesting. It's fun to read. When it was initially done, they thought it was a joke. They thought it was, somewhat of a false flag operation that Putin was using to flesh out who the loyalists were. He had, from what I've read, a flurry of phone calls and text messages saying, essentially, dude, what are you fucking doing? Pull that down. Are you insane? He didn't. He doubled down, and then he went and not only did the print version, but he did a live video, which is also available on the internet, YouTube. I'm sure you'll find it. Really what matters is not the moral content of his statement. What matters is the fact that he made it at all. This is not a liberal dissident who, finally found his conscience. This dude was part of the machine, this internal network of Putin. This is what makes this whole thing notable, because this is a defection from inside the loyalist propaganda / legal ecosystem. And these are extremely rare and very meaningful politically, much more meaningful than any criticism from the opposition, which anytime happens, the Kremlin automatically discounts as just hostile by definition. The timing on this one also is not random. His denunciation lands in the middle of Russia's escalating crackdown on Telegram and this broader internet access that I sort of hinted at, and I definitely want to talk about next episode. So since February 10th, Russian users have reported a lot of Telegram disruptions. A Human Rights Watch group says that there is confirmed gradual restrictions on Telegram. Medusa reports the block effectively began this week ahead of an anticipated full block on the 1st of April. And Reuters reports Russia fined Telegram again on March 16th. They are doing that a lot. Simply because Telegram is not allowing the Russian state, the kind of crackdown ability that they want. This whole digital crackdown, it's hitting a huge nerve because Telegram's not just a chat app in Russia. It is a very key command channel for the regime's own nationalist ecosystem, these Z bloggers. If you don't know, Russian news is pretty much controlled by the state. The only people that have kind of freedom of the press, and I'm using that term in the very loosest of senses, please do not compare it to anywhere else, is these Z bloggers. Why are they called Z bloggers? Because they're military bloggers who support the war in Ukraine. They put out a boatload of content that is almost always pro-Putin. The other thing that Telegram is used for is military fundraising. A lot of A lot of that is put out, kind of Facebook style through Telegram. And then the regime, Putin, the Kremlin, they use Telegram for a lot of narrative shaping, a lot of propaganda. And in some cases, at least from what I've been able to read, some frontline military communications, especially since Elon Musk took down their ability to use satellite communications. ISW, it's assessing this week that Russian forces were being ordered off Telegram, which likely worsened pre-existing command and control problems. Associated Press, FT, and other outlets all describe wider mobile internet restrictions, economic disruptions, and state pressure to move users onto this Kremlin-backed Max platform, right? So this is the core implication in all of this, is the Kremlin is now squeezing one of the very ecosystems it previously relied on to mobilize, radicalize, as well as discipline this pro-war public, the Soviet citizen. And when a regime like the Putin's starts breaking its own distribution network, it's usually because control anxiety has overtaken efficiency. And that is a coercive overcorrection. What do I think this likely means? I said I wouldn't get into this, but I'm getting into it a little bit. We're going to do a much deeper dive next week. All of this is evidence of a lot of stress inside Putin's loyalist camp, but it's not evidence of a regime collapse. The reporting around Remeslo itself notes a lot of shock, like I said, a lot of frantic calls from insider, but also it stresses that Putin's grip on power remains firm. Extraordinarily so. One loud loyalist, in this case, turning on him, it doesn't equal a split in the elites. Secondly, this trigger looks less ideological than systemic. His complaints reportedly bundled together a failed war in Ukraine, a lot of dead Russians, huge economic damage, and the country the sanctions they're damaging. A lot of corruption. Yeah, no shit. Russian oligarchs. You get rich off of your own individuals. A lot of tightening internet controls, which we just talked about. And this whole package together, it matters, really. It suggests that the Russian regime's vulnerabilities, they're kind of converging. You have a lot of battlefield attrition. A lot of Russians are tired of the war. Living standards are going down, and a much more intrusive security state. Thirdly, this is dangerous for the Kremlin precisely because it violates a taboo from the nationalist side. Opposition criticism can be dismissed as treason. Criticism from a known regime loyalists, it's harder to frame. It can seed kind of copycat permission structures and a lot of the Z space to complain much more openly, especially if these Telegram restrictions continue to damage their reach and business models. A lot of these Z bloggers are monetized in the same way that an influencer would here in America. They make their living off of reporting about the war in Ukraine, the war in Iran, the current events, much the same way a lot of our news organizations would. And you take away that business model, you're now going to radicalize them, potentially. Fourth, don't romanticize Remeslo. The narrative is very easy to see or to fall into this trap of like propagandists sees the light. And that's really probably not what is taking place. I think the more plausible options are he's genuinely disillusioned. I think he's panicking over the regime's tightening control. Maybe opportunistic reasoning for a post-Putin future. I don't see that happening. He could have just had a mental breakdown or some hybrid of those. There's not a lot of open source reporting on this, so it doesn't let us confidently separate conversion from self-preservation. Speaking of which, this dude's dead. He just signed his own death warrant. I mean, you've seen and we've talked about the Russians' history of poisoning and assassinating its own people that speak out, I give this guy a month if he's lucky. The use of the language that he used, yeah, great grammar, Brad. It's politically explosive because Putin is already subject to an international criminal court arrest warrant. And this goes back to 2023 over unlawful deportation and transfer of Ukrainian children. So when a former loyalist calls for Putin to be tried as a war criminal, he's not inventing some legal frame from nowhere. He's really just echoing what is already out there in the international criminal courts, an accusation that the Kremlin has spent years rejecting. I think this is a real signal, but it's a second order signal. It doesn't prove that there's an elite coup or some kind of coordinated purge or even an imminent regime fracture. I think it does show that the Kremlin's tightening of Telegram and their kind of digital authoritarianism and the cost of this war with Ukraine, they're now generating some visible blowback inside a lot of circles that were supposed to be regime safe. I'm wondering if there's not going to be more of this. I would say that if the Kremlin, and when I say Kremlin, I'm specifically saying Putin, if he doesn't murder this guy like PDQ, I wouldn't be surprised if there's a couple more of these that creep up. Yeah. I think the first time there are public cracks like this, it often appears in propagandists and a lot of auxiliary enforcers who realize that the machine may be coming to an end. I can only hope. I can only hope. I think there's still very limited direct access here to his original Telegram post in full. So the parts of the public account, a lot of which rely on secondary reporting, are where I have been reading. And there's no hard evidence that he represents some kind of broader organized faction inside the elite. I think this is, at least right now, an isolated rupture, but man, it's a pretty big one, dude. It's pretty big. I think that the near term is the variable here in the near term is the Telegram internet crackdown. And we're going to talk about that next week. So yeah, stay tuned for that. Well, my beer is empty, which means that is all of the time that we have today. I really appreciate everybody tuning in, supporting the show, sharing my honest and candid feedback with you. As always, I want to remind everybody that I do my level best to present to you an unbiased breakdown of world affairs and how you may be experiencing them, impacted by them, your place in them. When I give my opinion, I try to call it out. I do my best not to let it be biased or cloud my judgment. I am presenting to you a critical thinker's argument, and you can take from that what you will. I am not an administration hater. I am not an administration cheerleader. I am my own man. I am an independent thinker, and I go where logic and reason take me. And I want to take you with me on that. So again, I appreciate all of your listenership. I hope to see you again next week. And until I do, this is me, Brad Colbert, the Iceman, reminding all of you to stay frosty.
Improvise, adapt, and overcome.